Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
It's just a shirt.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Let me clean it up.
Before we begin, here's a question to sit with. Have you ever done something accidentally embarrassing in a room full of important people? Something you could not undo? Something that hung in the air for exactly the 3 seconds it took for everyone nearby to register what had just happened, and discovered, in the aftermath of it, that the person most affected was considerably more interesting than the situation had any right to produce? Drop your answer in the comments as you listen. Nadia Cole did not mean to splash wine on the man in the gray suit. She had turned quickly, more quickly than the room required, because she had heard her name called from somewhere behind her and had pivoted with the specific, full-body efficiency of someone who was already running slightly behind on 3 separate conversations at this gala and had not yet located the host to say the necessary things. She had pivoted. The wine glass had not pivoted with her. The man in the gray suit had been standing precisely where the wine decided to go. It was a full glass, a deep Cabernet. It landed on the lapel and the white shirt beneath and spread with the specific, irreversible enthusiasm of a liquid that has found its purpose. The room, which had been doing the specific, layered murmur of 200 people at an industry gala, went briefly, locally quiet in the 3-foot radius around them. Nadia turned and looked at what she had done. The man was looking at his jacket. Then he looked at her. His expression was not anger. It was the specific expression of someone who has just experienced something they find genuinely unexpected. She said, clearly, directly, without the flustered over-apology of someone who wanted the floor to open, "I am so sorry. That was completely my fault. Let me see what I can do about your jacket." He said, "I appreciate the honesty." There was something in the way he said it that was different from what she had expected. She was not yet sure what, but she was about to spend the next 40 minutes finding out. And her husband, across the room, was about to experience the specific, agonizing brand of social terror that only arrives when you watch your wife introduce herself to the man who owns your entire career. Some evenings go exactly as planned. You arrive at the right time, you say the right things to the right people, your dress is appropriate and your shoes are comfortable, and nothing irreversible happens to anyone's white shirt. This was not that evening. This is a story about the gala where the wine went sideways and the conversation that followed. It was the most honest thing either person had experienced in a room full of people who had gathered specifically to perform the polished, careful version of themselves. It is a story about a woman who splashed wine on a stranger and discovered, in the 40 minutes before anyone told her who he was, that the stranger was someone she would have wanted to know regardless of how the introduction had been made. It is also a story about what happens when the identity finally lands, and about a husband watching from across the room who understood, before anyone said a word, that the evening was going to require a conversation he had not prepared for. Before we begin, one asks, if this story finds something real in you today, write, "The wine changed everything" in the comments. Let this family know you are here. Now, let us begin. Nadia Cole was 36 years old and had spent the past 8 years building a marriage that was, by most of the measures her world applied to such things, successful. She had grown up in New Orleans, the daughter of a jazz musician father and a florist mother who had raised her in a household where the specific warmth of people who made beautiful things for a living filled every corner of the house. She had a degree in art history from Tulane and a master's in arts administration from NYU. And she had worked for 6 years at a contemporary art gallery in Manhattan before the marriage had relocated them to Atlanta, where she had found a curatorial position at a museum that suited her considerably and which she had grown into with the quiet, confident authority of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She was warm and direct and laughed easily and had the specific, attractive quality of someone who was genuinely interested in the person in front of them, not performing interest, not networking, but actually curious about the texture of people's lives and stories. She was also, if she was honest with herself in the specific way she sometimes was at 2 in the morning when the house was quiet, not entirely certain about some things she had been certain about 5 years ago. Not about her marriage in any dramatic sense. Not about Marcus specifically. About the particular shape their life together had taken. The way his career had expanded to fill most of the available space in their shared world. The way the gala tonight was one of 15 work events she had attended in the past year where the primary function was to be beside him rather than be entirely herself. She had dressed carefully tonight. A deep burgundy gown that she had chosen because she genuinely loved it, not because it would photograph well or communicate the right things to the right people. She had put on her best earrings, and she had told herself, on the car ride over, that she was going to have at least one conversation tonight that was entirely for herself. Marcus Cole was 41 years old and was, on the evening of the Hartwell Group's annual gala, in the specific elevated anxiety of a man who was 48 hours away from learning whether the promotion he had been working toward for 2 years had been approved. He had built his career in commercial real estate development with the steady, disciplined competence of someone who was genuinely good at his work and understood that being genuinely good at his work was the one reliable thing he controlled. He was a senior director at the Atlanta division of the Hartwell Group, one of the largest commercial real estate and investment firms on the East Coast. And he had spent the past 18 months on a proposal for an urban redevelopment project in southwest Atlanta that represented the most significant work of his career and on which a partnership decision was expected within the week. He had worked harder on this project than on anything before it. He had also, in the specific way of someone whose professional ambition was running at full capacity, been less present at home than he should have been. He knew this. He had told himself it was temporary. He was not certain Nadia believed the temporary part anymore. The man in the gray suit was Elijah Hart, 44 years old, the grandson of the man who had founded the Hartwell Group 70 years ago, and the person who, at 38, had taken the company from a respected regional firm into something considerably larger and more significant. A $15 billion enterprise with operations in 11 cities and a portfolio that included several of the most significant commercial developments on the East Coast. He was the principal of the organization at which Marcus Cole had spent 9 years building his career. He was, at this gala, doing what he did at all Hartwell Group events. Attending fully, speaking to people he had not met, moving through the room with the specific, unhurried quality of someone for whom this environment was native rather than aspirational, and doing it all with a low enough profile that the specific number of people who recognized him on first meeting was considerably smaller than the number of people who would have expected to recognize him. He did not look like the chairman of a $15 billion company. He looked like a man in a very good gray suit who had come to an industry gala without an entourage and without the specific performance of significance that most people of his standing felt compelled to arrange around themselves. He had been standing at the edge of a conversation when the wine arrived. He had not been unhappy before the wine arrived, but the 40 minutes after it were considerably more interesting than the 40 before it had been. The immediate aftermath had a specific texture. Nadia was already moving. The instinctive, efficient movement of someone who has done something with consequences and is addressing the consequences before the apology is even finished. She had a cocktail napkin in her hand before he had finished looking at his jacket. She was pressing it against the lapel with the specific, direct practicality of someone who understood that the situation required action rather than performance, and she was saying things that were honest and specific. This was completely my fault. I turned without looking. I am sorry about the shirt. I will cover the dry cleaning. Without any of the theatrical distress that the situation could have supported. He was watching her attend to his jacket with the specific, interested attention of someone who had expected flustered and received competent. He said, "You do not have to do that." She said, without looking up from the jacket, "I really do." It was a full glass. He said, "It was a full glass." She said, "Cabernet specifically, which is basically the worst option." He said, "I have had worse evenings." She looked up at him. There was something in his expression that was not what she had expected from a man whose jacket she had just ruined at a formal industry gala. It was warm and direct and contained the specific quality of someone who found the situation genuinely interesting rather than genuinely inconvenient. She said, "You are being very gracious about this." He said, "You are being very competent about it. It seems fair." The corner of her mouth moved. She said, "I am Nadia." He said, "Elijah." He said just the first name, not the last, not the title or the company or the specific, loaded social information that the last name would have delivered. Just Elijah. She filed this without examining why she filed it, and said, "Nadia Cole." And again, "I am genuinely sorry." He said, genuinely accepted. They stood for a moment in the specific, slightly unusual warmth of two people who had just shared an involuntary intimacy. His jacket in her hands, her focused attention on the damage, the very small shared space of an accident being addressed. She stepped back. She said, "I think the lapel will survive. The shirt is probably a different story." He looked down at the shirt. He said, "I have other shirts." She said, "That is a very healthy perspective on a ruined shirt." He laughed, not a polite Gala laugh, an actual one, the kind that arrived without being arranged. She had not been expecting that either. Across the room, Marcus Cole had watched the wine splash happen with the specific, delayed understanding of a man who registers that something significant has occurred approximately 3 seconds after it has occurred. He had seen the pivot. He had seen the glass. He had seen the Cabernet find its destination. He had started moving toward his wife with the instinctive, protective energy of a spouse crossing a room to assist with a social situation. He had gotten approximately 6 feet before he recognized the gray suit. He stopped. He stood 6 feet from the moment, unable to move forward and unable to explain to anyone watching why he had stopped, because explaining would require identifying the man in the gray suit, and identifying the man in the gray suit would require the entire room to understand that his wife had just poured Cabernet on the principle of the organization at which he was 48 hours away from a partnership decision. He stood 6 feet away and watched his wife handle the situation with a composure and warmth that he recognized as entirely hers, and that was, under the circumstances, simultaneously impressive and absolutely terrifying. The conversation had continued, not because either of them had planned it to. Because the cocktail napkin operation had produced a natural pause, and the natural pause had produced a question from him about the event, and her answer had been more interesting than most answers he received to that question at industry galas, and his response to her answer had been more interesting than most responses she received from the kind of man who attended industry galas in very good gray suits, and the next thing that happened was that they were both holding fresh glasses of something. That was not Cabernet, and standing slightly apart from the nearest cluster of people and talking. She told him about the museum, not as a job description, as the thing she had spent 6 years working toward and 2 years building into something she was proud of, with the specific, warm precision of someone who finds their work genuinely interesting. He listened with the quality of attention she had noticed when she was pressing the napkin against his jacket. Unhurried, fully present, the kind that asked the next question because it genuinely wanted the answer rather than because it was maintaining the social contract of a gala conversation. He asked about the current exhibition. She told him. He said something about the specific artist she had mentioned that was not the response of someone who had Googled the artist as social preparation, but the response of someone who had a genuine relationship with the work and a perspective on it that she found unexpectedly considered. She said, "You know this artist's work." He said, "I bought a piece of it 6 years ago. I have been looking at it in my office since." She said, "Which piece?" He told her. She looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating. She said, "That piece has not been on the market in years. The artist stopped selling individual works after the Berlin series." He said, "I know. I bought it before that." She said, "You saw what was coming." He said, "I saw what was already there. Everyone else caught up eventually." She looked at him. She said, "That is either the most pretentious thing I have heard tonight or the most honest." He said, "I think it is both." She laughed. The full one. The one that arrived without being arranged. He had not been expecting that either. Have you ever met someone in the middle of an embarrassing situation and discovered that the embarrassment was the best possible introduction because it stripped away every managed layer from the first 30 seconds? And what happened next? 40 minutes passed. This was notable for 2 reasons. The first was that 40 minutes at an industry gala is a very long time to spend in a single conversation. The social choreography of these events was organized around 15-minute engagements, long enough to establish the relationship, short enough to maintain the currency of your availability to the rest of the room. 40 minutes in one place communicated either that you had forgotten the choreography or that something more important than the choreography was happening. The second was that in those 40 minutes, neither of them had provided the information that would have changed everything. He had not told her his last name. She had not asked the professional question, "And what do you do?" in the specific way that would have produced the answer that produced the recognition that would have changed the register of the conversation entirely. It was not that they had avoided the professional. They had talked about work. His interest in development and infrastructure, her work at the museum, the specific pleasure of building things that outlasted the moment of their creation. But it had been conversation rather than positioning, and neither of them had offered their information in the specific, loaded way of people at industry galas who understood that the most important thing they said in the first 5 minutes was usually their title. She knew his name was Elijah. He knew she was Nadia Cole, that she ran the curatorial program at the museum, that her mother had been a florist in New Orleans, and that she could tell within 30 seconds of looking at a piece of work whether it had been made by someone who believed in what they were doing. She did not know he owned the company her husband had spent 9 years building his career at. He did not know her husband was one of his employees. For 40 minutes, they were just two people in a very good conversation. Marcus had not moved from his 6-foot remove. He had been approached by 2 colleagues and a client during those 40 minutes, and had managed each conversation with the specific fragmented attention of someone whose primary consciousness was entirely elsewhere. He had watched his wife talk to Elijah Hart for 40 minutes with a quality of engagement he recognized because he had seen it before. Not recently, not often enough, but he had seen it. The specific quality of Nadia when she was genuinely in a conversation rather than attending one. He had watched Elijah Hart, the most significant person in any room he entered, a man whose attention was the most professionally coveted thing in the Hartwell Group's ecosystem, give the full weight of that attention to his wife for 40 minutes and look like he was doing exactly what he wanted to be doing. Marcus understood something in those 40 minutes that he had not understood with complete clarity before them. Not something new. Something he had known for 2 years and had been moving around the edges of without looking at it directly. He looked at it directly. He looked at it for 40 minutes. She had been mid-sentence when she saw his expression change. Not a dramatic change. Subtle. The specific, internal recalibration of someone who has received a piece of information from elsewhere in the room. A colleague of his had appeared briefly at his elbow and said something quiet, 2 sentences, maybe 3, and moved away. She had watched his expression receive the information and process it and arrive at something. She said what? He looked at her. He said, "Your husband is Marcus Cole." It was not a question. She said, "Yes." He said, "Senior Director, Southwest Atlanta Redevelopment Project." She heard the specific quality of how he said it. Not as a question, not as a discovery, but as a confirmation of something he was connecting to existing information. She said, "How do you know that?" He said, "Because I read the proposal 3 weeks ago." She looked at him. Something in the quality of his answer was landing in her understanding in a way that was taking a moment to arrive fully. She said, "You read the proposal." He said, "It is an exceptional proposal. Genuinely. The community integration model in the Southwest Quadrant is the most thoughtful approach to that neighborhood I have seen in a development proposal of this scale." She said, "You are." She stopped. He waited. The information was arriving. She said, "You are Elijah Hart." He said, "Yes." She said, "Of the Hartwell Group." He said, "Yes." She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "I poured Cabernet on Elijah Hart." He said, "You did." She said, "My husband's Elijah Hart." He said, "I think he would phrase that differently, but yes." She closed her eyes for approximately 2 seconds. When she opened them, he was watching her with the expression he had been wearing since the wine. The warm, direct, genuinely interested expression of a man who found this situation considerably more interesting than his evening had been before the wine arrived. She said, "I owe you a very expensive dry cleaning bill and possibly an apology from my husband." He said, "You do not owe me anything." The conversation was worth considerably more than the jacket. She looked at him. He said it simply, without performance. She said, "You are being honest." He said, "It seemed like the right room for it." Marcus had been watching the expression on his wife's face from his 6-foot remove when the information landed. He had seen the moment she understood who she had been talking to. He had seen the 2 seconds with closed eyes. He had understood that the period of watching from a distance had ended and that there was only one way forward from here, and it was toward the conversation rather than away from it. He walked across the remaining 6 feet. He arrived at his wife's side with the composed expression of a man who had spent 2 minutes deciding what his face was going to do and had landed on professional warmth that was doing its best work under considerable pressure. He said, "Elijah, it is good to see you tonight." Elijah said, "Marcus, your wife has been excellent company." Marcus said, "I can imagine." The specific tension in that phrase, "I can imagine," was the tension of a man who had been watching from across the room for 40 minutes and who was managing the specific, layered discomfort of professional anxiety and personal clarity simultaneously. Nadia looked at her husband. She looked at him with the full, warm, direct attention she had been giving Elijah Hart for the past 40 minutes. And noticed something in the looking that she had been not quite noticing for 2 years. Not that she did not love him. She did. But that the full attention had somewhere along the way become a thing she gave other people more easily than she gave him. And that part of the reason for that was that the full attention had stopped being consistently received. She did not say any of this. She said, "I appear to have ruined his jacket." Marcus looked at the jacket. His expression moved through several things. Elijah said, "It is genuinely fine. The jacket was the best thing that happened to my evening." Marcus looked at Elijah. Elijah said it with the specific, clear warmth of someone who meant it and was not arranging it for effect. Marcus said, "I am glad to hear that." He said it carefully. The three of them stood in the specific, electric configuration of a husband and wife and a man who had spent 40 minutes in the best conversation of his gala evening with the wife, while the husband watched from 6 feet away. Elijah turned to Marcus. He said, "The Southwest Atlanta proposal. I want to schedule time next week. Not to discuss the decision, to discuss the community integration model specifically. I want to understand how you arrived at it." Marcus said, "Of course. Absolutely." Elijah said, "It is the kind of thinking the company needs more of." He said it simply, not as flattery and not as a verdict on the partnership question, as a professional observation from someone who had read the proposal and had a view on it. Marcus received it with the expression of a man receiving something significant and trying to process it without losing the composure that the context required. Elijah turned to Nadia. He said, "The dry cleaning is not necessary. But if the museum ever has a piece it thinks belongs in my office, I trust your judgment." She said, "I will keep that in mind." He said, "It was genuinely a pleasure." He said it to her, specifically, with the direct, warm courtesy of someone closing a conversation they had valued. She said, "The pleasure was mine, despite the circumstances." He said, "Because of them." He nodded to Marcus. He moved away into the room with the same unhurried quality with which he had been moving through it all evening. They stood together in the space he had left. The gala continued around them. She said, "I did not know who he was." Marcus said, "I know." She said, "I turned, and the wine went, and I had no way to." He said, "I know." Nadia, "I know." She heard something in the way he said it. Not accusation, something more honest than accusation. The specific quality of a man who had just spent 40 minutes with a clear view of something he had been not quite looking at. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the space where Elijah Hart had been. He said, "He is going to offer me the partnership." She said, "Yes, I think he is." He said, "And I have been working toward it for 2 years." She said, "I know." He said, "At the cost of a number of things I told myself were temporary." She said nothing. He said, "I have been watching you from across this room for 40 minutes. She waited. He said, "You were talking to a man you had just accidentally covered in Cabernet, and you were more fully present in that conversation than I have seen you in." He stopped. "Then I have made space for you to be with me. In a long time." She looked at him. He said, "That is not his fault. And it is not your fault. It is something I need to look at." She said, "Yes, it is." He said, "I know." The gala was warm and loud around them. She said, "The partnership is real and the work is yours and I am proud of you for it." He said, "I know." She said, "And we need to have a conversation that is not about the partnership." He said, "Yes, we do." She said, "Not tonight." He said, "No, not tonight." She took his arm. Not because everything was resolved, it was not, but because the conversation that needed to happen had been named, and the naming of it was its own form of progress. They moved back into the gala. She was still wearing her best earrings. He was beside her in a way that was slightly more present than he had been when they arrived. Later, in the car on the way home, the city moving past the windows in the specific golden blur of a late Atlanta evening. She thought about 40 minutes in a ballroom with a man in a gray suit who had told her, simply, that the conversation was worth considerably more than the jacket. She thought about the specific quality of being heard with full attention. She thought about how long it had been since she had felt that in her own home. Not never. Not recently enough. She looked at her husband in the driver's seat. He was looking at the road. She said, "The conversation is not tonight. But soon." He said, "Yes, soon." He reached across and took her hand on the console between them. She let him. She looked out at the Atlanta night. Something had shifted. Not resolved. Shifted. In a marriage, sometimes that is where the real work begins. Nadia Cole splashed wine on a stranger at a gala. She handled it with honesty and competence, and without performance. The stranger responded with warmth and genuine interest. For 40 minutes, before anyone said the name that changed everything, they had a conversation that was entirely real, stripped of every managed layer by the specific, involuntary intimacy of an accident. Then the name landed. And her husband arrived from his 6-foot remove. And the man in the gray suit confirmed that the most significant professional moment of Marcus's career was coming. And then he told Nadia that the conversation had been worth considerably more than the jacket. He said it simply, without performance. And she believed him, because the 40 minutes had been real. And the truth she had spent 4 years not quite looking at. That she was a woman who deserved the full weight of someone's attention and had been giving that gift to everyone except the person she had promised to give it to, had arrived in the specific form of a ruined jacket at a ballroom gala. Marriages do not end at galas, but sometimes they turn at them. What happens next in the Cole household is not a story about the wine. It is a story about a woman who deserved to be fully seen. And about whether the man who loved her understood that before he lost the chance to be the one who did it. Final question for you. Have you ever been in a situation where the most honest moment of an evening arrived not through a planned conversation, but through something you could not have arranged if you tried? Leave your answer below. Your voice belongs in this conversation. If this story found something real in you today, share it with someone who needs it. One share. It costs nothing and means everything. I love you all. I will see you in the next story.